Like, for example, this may be useful for any sort of false flag operation, which is an absolute staple of American intelligence, as you may know. Like, it's their primary tool. So in order to make the public's awareness focused on some process, or at least implied process, if you know what I mean, one can simply arrange an event and then like shine a light on it from an appropriate angle, and then these wicked shadows would appear, you know, this evil, bad process would be perceived by the public, even though it may not even be there, even though it is completely like made up. All right. Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Here I wish to address the events and processes and how do we perceive both of them. Actually, my point would be that we can only perceive events, not processes. And that's the inherent nature of our perception, like the dramatic character thereof, which I've talked about in my previous videos, like an older ones, for example, the one on mythology, link in the description, the one on the stories of history, link in the description, so suit yourself if you wish. So hence we always adjust our spatial and temporal focus to dramatize the process into an event, to make it perceivable. And plus with our mass media and pop culture training, we always expect a big show out of everything, if you know what I mean. And here I remember Nietzsche's quote from Thus Spake Zarathustra. One of the people called out, "We have now heard enough of the rope dancer. It is time now for us to see him." Which is kind of ironic because to see him meaning to perceive the event, right? And we have heard enough of the rope dancers, like the process, right? There is some vague rope dancer somewhere. Let us see him. Let us actually witness the event, so to speak. And it is kind of ironic because to see him, that this guy said in the text, was referring to Superman that Zarathustra was talking about, but the rope dancer misinterpreted it, like the public was actually wanting to see him, meaning rope dancer, instead of the Superman. Okay, so, and this irony would return in the end of this video, where we'll talk about false flag operations. Misinterpretation of the event, if you wish. So, okay. One example of such eventification, if you wish, would be the collapse of society, which I talked about in literally the previous video, the end of the Western civilization. Again, see the link in the description. So we expect to literally witness the falling asteroid or the opening of the gates of hell or something like that, right? When we think about the end of the civilization, the end of the world, etc., etc. But in reality, of course, such processes often take a very long time, like centuries, for example. And so it seems like actually, when you're in it, nothing is really happening, so to speak. And again, see my video on the collapse of the Western civilization to understand that it's probably not happening, okay? The Russian politologist, Ekaterina Shulman, who I've referenced before in one of my, like, again, older videos, or maybe more than one. So she had a program on one of the radios, which was called, like, it was like a weekly program where she addressed, like, the current political topics in Russia, and not only in Russia, but one of the, like, segments of this program was called "Не новости, но события," which you might translate like, not news, but events. But in this context, like, events, even a wrong translation, at least with respect to what I'm referring to here. So it's more like not news, but developments, or not news, but milestones. And she actually herself has always, emphasized the importance of trends, like not data points, but trends, right? The tendencies, okay? So that was the main pathos, the main idea of this, segment. So yeah, we're talking about processes, not events, in the context of this video of mine, in this case. So, but even the trends, if you think about it, like I've already said, that the processes are imperceivable in nature, so we have to, like, how do you say it, provisionally eventify them in order to perceive them, right? But still, if we think about processes or trends, even they can be part of larger processes or trends always, right? If you look at the market, there is a motion upwards, but it's a part of a larger scale motion downwards, for example, right? The Elliott wave analysis, etc., etc. So yeah, and in these other trends, larger scale trends may have an opposite direction, for example, right? So we need to put an event into context to put it, to find its meaning. And even the process, if we eventify it in order to be able to perceive it, we still have to put it in the context of a larger process. So we have to eventify even a larger event, process, like behind it in the background, right? And the problem is, and that's really the point of this video, that the context itself, like again, this larger scale process is a process. And we can only perceive processes, again, by eventifying them. So an actual event that we perceive is just a part of a bigger event, if you wish, in our perception at least. That's how we look at it in a practical sense. An example. Like, there is a piece of news, which says that something like, I don't know, like, miners go on strike, as the price of copper keeps dropping, for example, alright? So that's something that we can perceive, and that's something that can get into news, because yeah, it sounds like a piece of news, right? Like, it sounds legit, because we have a clear event, like the miners go on strike, that's an event, alright? But the price of copper keeps dropping, it's a process. And yet, in order to, it's not an event, right? And it can only be perceived, again, on a longer time scale, right? Where it can be eventified. So we have to look at the price of copper, and we have to, at the graph that is, and we have to like zoom out so that we would see like in a few centimeters of a screen this drop, alright? Or for you it's like this. So we eventify it, like it was like this, but suddenly it's like this, like boom, it dropped, right? It's an event already. So this is what I call eventification of a process, like zooming out and dramatizing it so that it can be perceived like almost in a moment, right? Like in a theater, like somebody has shot someone or something like that, like something dropped, right? Like when it's just dropping, well, today it's not dropping. There is a fixed price, more or less. Of course, it changes, etc., fluctuates, but it's not as noticeable as when you zoom out for yearly graph, for example, right? So this is what I mean by eventification of the process. And how do we determine the actual trends, the actual processes, if we are able to eventify them? They are perceivable in this case, if we are able to eventify them, that is. After all, well, an analogy here would be like, or an example as well, would be like the Marxist approach, where Marxism says there is base and there is superstructure on top of it. Like what is base, in case of Marxism, is means of production and relations of production, right? And the superstructure is everything on top of it, the culture, the politics, society as it is, etc., societal structures. So in this case, what are we doing in this Marxist approach? We perceive an event that is something from the realm of culture or society or politics, and we try to translate it into the background, into the base, into the means of production, distribution or whatever else of that sort. So this is an example of eventification of a process. We even under Marxist theory itself, we imply there are some processes which are like changes in the distribution of means of production, for example, but we cannot perceive them directly. We have to eventify them from these secondary observable events, which are like situated in the superstructure in terms of Marxism. Okay, but like, and you can like absolutize the very same logic further. Like Marxism is just materialism, right? But an extreme materialism, I would say, is actually pure logic and philosophy. So again, as I've quoted Ludwig Boltzmann, who said that nothing is more practical than a good theory. Well, I completely agree here. Like the purest logic and philosophy is actually the most materialist of materialist things that you can arrive at. So yeah. And at the end of the day, all of it is actually just means of conceptualization, right? The representation of what's going on. See my video, Nature of Knowledge, where I say that all of the knowledge is pretty much just a bunch of stories we tell each other in order to orient in the world, in order to figure the world out. And what's important here is that it's the conceptualization or representation of stuff from where we are right now. All right? Hence, by definition, indifferent here and now, indifferent we as well, the conceptualization would be different. Thus, even a process itself is just a representation, a shadow of reality, if you wish. So the same point, the same event in the context of this video may be projected in different angles, right? You might look at it from different angles, and like the shadow of it, like as you're shining like a flashlight onto it. So the shadow of this event would give you different processes that you may imply from this event, all right? So the same object can give us different shadows. And the same, or rather, the same event can be de-eventified into different processes, if you know what I mean. So, yeah, we can conclude about different processes from the same event, if you wish. We can reconstruct the process, re-eventify it from an actual event differently, depending on our, well, various factors. So one factor is actually the meaning itself. Watch my video, Meaning of Life, by the way. So one has to invoke meaning. Otherwise the process cannot be constructed, right? The process has some logic, has some drama, it has some intrinsic conflict. The price of copper dropped. Maybe it's bad, maybe it's good. So this is the intrinsic conflict, all right? Like we would like the price of copper to be high, but it dropped. Here's the drama, right? A drama of this particular event. Or rather, actually process that we eventify in order to perceive it, all right? So, so one has to invoke meaning in order to perceive this process, and meaning is goal dependent, and the goals are will dependent. Hence, the processes that we perceive, i.e. eventify and then perceive, tell more about ourselves, actually, than about the reality, whatever it is, as Stephen Hawking loved to say. Watch my video about Stephen Hawking, by the way. So we kind of conclude from that, yeah, actually the will to power seems to be the most important thing, even in perception of processes, even in perception of events, which is the only thing we can perceive, actually. Hence, we acknowledge the event with our low-level machinery, so to speak, i.e. organs of perception, for example, and then from it, we may reconstruct will into being, so to speak, the supposed process that this event signifies, according to our value system, our will, ultimately, or the will of the structure we are part of. That's another possibility. Yeah, and this is true especially for the negative events. See my video, Obsession with Safety, quite a recent one. So negative events grab our attention quite a bit. So here we may completely make things up. Like, for example, this may be useful for any sort of false flag operation, which is an absolute staple of American intelligence, as you may know. Like, it's their primary tool. So in order to make the public's awareness focused on some process, or at least implied process, if you know what I mean, one can simply arrange an event and then like shine a light on it from an appropriate angle, and then these wicked shadows would appear, you know, this evil, bad process would be perceived by the public, even though it may not even be there, even though it's completely like made up. All right. But that's the logic of our perception. Again, to conclude, we cannot perceive processes, we can only perceive events. Process is really only implied from the events, and in order to even be perceived, the process should be eventified, dramatized, condensed into a very short event. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.